Snoop Dogg walked leisurely into the airport, his usual confidence like armor. After passing through security, he made his way to the gate where first class was waiting for him, an area where comfort was not a luxury but a necessity. The staff smiled, passengers sneakily took pictures, and everything went on as usual until it was time to board. As soon as Snoop stepped onto the ramp, he was met by the pilot's stern gaze. Instead of a greeting or a polite nod, the man silently slid his gaze over Snoop as if assessing him. It seemed strange at first, but no one paid it any mind. After a moment, however, everything changed. "I'm sorry, sir," came the pilot's cold voice as Snoop approached his seat. "You can't sit here." Snoop thought it was a joke at first and smiled faintly. However, the pilot's face remained stony. "What do you mean I can't?" Snoop lifted his glasses and looked straight at him. The pilot leaned in slightly, as if he wanted to say something just for him, but his words came out loud enough for everyone in the nearest rows to hear. "Your ticket has not been confirmed. Besides, we have rules, and I think you will be more comfortable in another cabin." Those words sounded like a spit in the face. In another cabin? As if his place was not in first class but somewhere in the back. The atmosphere on board changed instantly. A few passengers froze, some began to whisper. Snoop wasn't going to make a scene, but his crew, who had already taken their seats, were immediately alert. Snoop's manager approached the pilot, trying to clarify what the problem was. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person. This is Snoop Dogg, and he has a first-class ticket." The pilot looked at the manager as if he had said something incredibly ridiculous. "I know who he is," he said with a hint of a cold chuckle. "But like I said, the rules are the same for everyone." Snoop was still silent, but his eyes glittered with icy anger. That tone. It wasn't a simple misunderstanding. There was a certain confidence in the pilot's voice, as if he wanted to put the star in his place. "Do you have a problem with my ticket or with me?" Snoop finally asked calmly, but with a clear threat. "I'm just doing my job, sir," came the evasive reply. Those words sounded like a subtle hint that his job included the right to decide who was worthy of comfort and who was not. There was movement in the back rows. Passengers started pulling out their phones. Someone turned on a recording. One of them said out loud, "Is that racist? Why can't he stay?" The pilot blushed, but continued to stand his ground. "If you want to fly," he stated, "please go to economy class." That last phrase, which sounded loud and humiliating, as if he was talking not to a hip-hop legend but to someone who had accidentally wandered into the wrong place, was the final point. Snoop's team stood up as one man, and Snoop himself, while remaining outwardly calm, was seething with anger inside. A tension hung in the air that could be felt physically. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was personal. Snoop stood clutching the armrest of the nearest chair tightly, trying to figure out if he'd really heard correctly. His seat in first class, his paid ticket, his status, all of that was suddenly in doubt. But not because of a bug in the system or a canceled flight. No, the problem was clearly deeper than that. "I'm sorry." Snoop stepped forward, looking straight into the pilot's eyes. His voice was quiet, but there was a tension in it that would send chills down anyone's spine. "Why don't you tell me what you mean?" The pilot, without averting his gaze, replied with a barely perceptible chuckle. "I said, this place is not for you, sir. I think you know what I mean." Those words hit like a slap in the face. They sounded as if there was something dirty and unspoken behind them. The passengers began to whisper. A few people, sitting nearby, raised their heads in surprise, trying to make sense of what was happening. I'm sorry. I don't understand. Snoop leaned forward slightly, not taking his eyes off the pilot. Explain. The pilot seemed pleased with the situation. His tone became a little louder, as if he wanted the other passengers to hear. Are you flying first class on this flight? Well, we have certain standards. Those words sounded like an insult. Certain standards? This was no longer just a reference to an alleged mistake with a ticket. It was something personal, a hint too obvious to miss. Snoop remained silent, though a lightning bolt of anger flashed in his eyes. His manager, standing nearby, stepped forward. What are you trying to say? Our tickets are paid for, our paperwork's in order. What standards are you referring to? The pilot looked at him with frank coldness. I'm just saying that sometimes a first-class seat doesn't always fit the passenger. The air on board became heavy, as if before a thunderstorm. Passengers in first class began to look at each other, some furtively pulling out their phones. This went beyond the usual misunderstandings. Tell me straight. Snoop's voice became a tone lower but more dangerous. You don't think I'm fit for first class? Why not? The pilot didn't answer immediately. A shadow of doubt appeared on his face, but he still dropped a phrase that made everyone freeze. Because this place is for those who understand how to behave. Those words sounded like an explosion. Some of the passengers gasped loudly. Others barely contained their indignation. One of them, an elderly man in a business suit, couldn't stand it any longer. This is outrageous. He's your passenger, just like us. The pilot glanced nervously at the man, but immediately returned his attention to Snoop. Rules are rules, he repeated. You can go to the maintenance staff, but I don't think it will make a difference. He seemed to be deliberately trying to humiliate him in front of everyone, questioning not only Snoop's right to be in first grade, but his place in this society. Rules? Snoop finally spoke, slowly standing up to his full height so that his figure obscured the narrow aisle. You trying to tell me I don't fit your rules because I'm black? His words were like thunder. The pilot turned pale, but quickly regained his mask. Those are your words, sir, not mine. Now the tension was at its peak. Some passengers began to express their indignation aloud. One of them exclaimed, "This is totally unacceptable. We all see what is happening here." Snoop's team kept insisting that the pilot should apologize and allow him to take his seat. But he wasn't about to give up his position. "If you're not satisfied," he finally said, "you can always leave the plane." Those words, spoken with icy indifference, were the last straw. It wasn't just a challenge, it was open humiliation. And now, the whole atmosphere on board was saturated with a tension that promised this wouldn't just end. Snoop straightened, his tall figure looming over the pilot, but his voice remained calm, almost icy. It was the way he acted when he felt he was about to explode. He'd been the center of attention for too long to let himself lose control, but those who knew him understood that behind that calmness lurked a storm. "Explain," he said briefly, looking straight into the pilot's eyes. "On what grounds do you think I can't take the seat I paid for?" The words were spoken quietly, but there was a sense of menace in them, like the calm before a storm. The pilot, who had seemed confident up to that moment, hesitated for a moment, but then his face regained its haughty expression. "I've already explained everything, sir," he said with feigned politeness. "If you want to discuss it further, you can ask our staff." Snoop nodded slowly, as if in agreement. Then he turned to the stewardess standing nearby. "Is this normal?" he asked her, pointing his thumb in the direction of the pilot. I really want to understand. Is this your airline's policy or this man's personal opinion? The stewardess, a young girl with a confused face, looked like she was ready to fall through the ground. She knew that every passenger was looking at her, including those who were already recording what was happening on their phones. Mr. Dogg, she began tentatively, we don't have a policy against your being placed in first class. Then, what are these standards? Snoop continued, looking at her. Because this man just told me I wasn't right for this place. Her face went white, and she glanced at the pilot, who was looking at her as if he expected support. But the girl remained silent. So, it's personal, Snoop summarized, turning to the pilot again. Okay, now I get it. The pilot took a step back, but, not wanting to show weakness, tried to hold his position. Sir, I didn't mean anything personal. It's just that there are certain expectations of first-class passengers. Which ones? Snoop interrupted him sharply, but without raising his voice. Do you have a dress code? Maybe I don't fit your atmosphere? Or maybe my skin color doesn't fit your ideal first class? These words caused a real explosion among the passengers. Some loudly supported Snoop, others loudly resented the pilot's behavior. A woman in the back row jumped up from her seat. This is outrageous. We all know what he means. Another man shouted, Why are you still arguing with him? He deserves better treatment than this. The pilot seemed to be losing control of the situation. He glanced toward the cockpit as if looking for support, but it was too late. The entire cabin was already on Snoop's side. Snoop himself still stood motionless, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave his arms, but there was something so powerful in his calmness that it seemed capable of shattering the thin mask of politeness that the pilot wore. You know what? Snoop finally said, his voice so quiet that the passengers froze to hear every word. I can take a lot of shit. I've seen worse in this life, but when you stand here and try to humiliate me just because I don't fit into your narrow picture of the world, it's not about me anymore. This is about you. The pilot turned pale. His arrogance was gone, but he was still trying to maintain some control. Sir, if you want to continue this discussion, I'll call security. Snoop grinned, and that grin was intimidating. Call, he said. Call whoever you want, because I'm not moving from this spot until you explain to everyone here why you thought I wasn't worthy of first class. These words caused a loud noise in the cabin. Passengers began to shout their outrage. Phones were directed at the pilot, who now looked absolutely lost. The atmosphere had heated up to the limit. All that was left for the pilot to do was to either back down or continue to break his own future. The whisper went through the cabin like an electric shock. The passengers looked at each other, many of them furtively filming what was happening. Some of them leaned toward their neighbors, others tried unsuccessfully to hide their indignation. The atmosphere was getting heavier and heavier, as if the stifling smoke of injustice hung in the air. Was it because of his skin? Came a loud whisper from a woman at the end of the row. Her words, though addressed to the husband sitting next to her, were heard by everyone. The pilot tensed. He sensed that the situation was getting out of control, but now any movement he made only increased suspicion. Snoop stood still, and though his posture remained relaxed, his gaze was fixed on the pilot. He remained silent, letting the pressure around him build. The passengers seated closest to him began to discuss what was happening more loudly. "It's racist," came the voice of a man in the middle row. "If it had been someone else, it wouldn't have happened." The pilot turned sharply to the man who had spoken. "Sir, I won't let you accuse me of something I didn't do," he said, but his voice trembled. "Then what are you doing?" The man wouldn't stop. "Why are you so categorical? Do you have any personal standards?" The pilot averted his gaze, then turned back to Snoop. "Sir," he began, as if to justify himself, but his voice still sounded cold. "This has nothing to do with your identity." The words sounded like a slap in the face. There was a strange emphasis on the word personalities in his voice, as if he wanted to say something else, but thought better of it in time. The passengers noticed this, and a volley of indignation swept the cabin. "Say it straight," shouted someone from the back row. "He didn't say anything specific, but we all know what he means. That's a pure discrimination." The stewardess nervously approached the pilot, whispering in an attempt to persuade him to end the conflict. But her words, apparently, only made him angry. "There's no discrimination here," he said loudly, as if trying to overpower the cheers around him. "But if someone feels uncomfortable, it's not my fault." These words again caused an explosion of emotion among the passengers. "Not your fault?" exclaimed the woman in the business suit. "You're trying to kick out a man who deserves a place here more than any of us, and you think that's okay?" Snoop finally spoke, his voice as hard as granite. "You just said, 'It's not my fault.' Whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that you think I'm unworthy? Say it straight out so we can all hear it." His words sounded louder than any scream. The pilot lost his temper. "Sir, if you want to think it's racist, that's your right," he blurted out, trying to justify himself. "But I'm just following my observations." "Observations?" Snoop stepped forward, his eyes throwing lightning bolts. "What observations? That I look different from you? Or do you think I don't have a right to be here just because I'm different?" The pilot was silent. His lips trembled, but he couldn't find the words to explain himself. This moment was the point of no return. One of the passengers, a young guy in a sports jacket, rose from his seat. "We can all see what's going on here," he said loudly enough to be heard. "It's not about the ticket anymore. It's about the color of his skin, and it's disgusting." People began to applaud, cheering his words. The cameras were now pointed not only at the pilot and Snoop, but at the entire cabin. The shouts and cheers grew louder and louder. "If the airline is supporting this, we should all know about it," someone shouted. The pilot tried to say something, but his voice was drowned in the general noise. The passengers began to stand up, showing that they were ready to go to the end for justice. Snoop looked around, his face expressing a mixture of gratitude and hidden anger. He knew it was no longer about him, but about showing the world that such things were not acceptable. "If you can't explain," he finally said, turning to the pilot again, "then you shouldn't be in this place, and we'll all make sure it gets out." His words were the beginning of the end for the pilot. The cameras continued to capture every moment, turning this incident into more than just a conflict on board the plane. Things were getting tense on board. Passengers kept cheering Snoop on, but it was at this point that his team decided to take matters into their own hands. When people who saw injustice on a daily basis came together to defend their leader, something truly powerful happened. The first to rise was Snoop's manager, James, a man who had dealt with many such situations in his career. His voice was clear and loud. It broke the atmosphere like thunder. "I want to talk to your management," he said, looking at the pilot as if he were a minor obstacle. "Right now. You have no right to make such decisions without reason." The pilot, who had looked confident a moment ago, now felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. He looked at the stewardess standing next to him and nodded to her to call the chief flight attendant. Meanwhile, the second crew member, Monica, Snoop's PR manager, pulled out her phone and started capturing everything that was happening on camera, filming both the pilot and the passengers' reactions. "Do you realize what you're doing?" she asked the pilot. "We're not just talking about Snoop Dogg being an international star right now. We're talking about human rights, about discrimination. That's what's going to be the #1 news story as soon as we get off this flight." "Lady, I'm just doing my job." The pilot tried to justify himself, but his voice trembled. "Doing your job?" James interrupted her, approaching the pilot. His tone was menacing. "Show me a rule that says you can kick a man out of first class because he paused. "Looks different from you." The pilot took a step back, but a senior flight attendant called by the stewardess intervened. He was middle-aged with a poise that spoke of years of experience, but even he was unprepared for what was happening. "What's going on here?" he asked, glancing around the noisy cabin. James immediately walked over to him, showing him Snoop's ticket. "Your pilot is trying to kick my client out of first class despite his legitimate ticket, and he makes no secret of the fact that he's doing it out of personal bias." The flight attendant frowned and turned to the pilot. "Is that true? I was just trying to make sure our passengers met first-class standards." The pilot barely squeezed out. "Standards?" Monica repeated, her voice tingling with sarcasm. "And what are these standards? Do we have a list of requirements here? Maybe you can write that people of color don't fit into your vision?" These words caused a new explosion of emotion in the cabin. Someone shouted, "He's trying to get out of it. Don't let him get away with it." "Yes, let him explain himself." The senior flight attendant realized the situation was out of control and tried to smooth things over. "Dear passengers, please remain calm. We will deal with this situation." But James wasn't going to back down anymore. "Do you think that's enough?" he asked. "No, you don't understand. We will not be silent. Are you trying to cover up racism?" The passengers began to applaud James's words, cheering him on. The chief steward, trying to calm the growing tension, turned to the pilot. "You need to explain yourself." "Now." But the pilot kept backing away. His face reddened. He nervously adjusted the collar of his uniform and muttered, "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was just following my feelings." "To your senses," Monica interjected sharply. "Your feelings are discrimination, and we'll prove it." She turned to the stewardess. "I want you to call the company's ground leadership immediately. Either handle it here, or we make it public." The senior flight attendant nodded, realizing that he had no way out. He instructed the flight attendant to contact the ground staff. Meanwhile, James added loudly, addressing the passengers, "You all see what's going on. This is not just a personal conflict. This is a problem we face all the time and can no longer be ignored." The passengers started clapping, shouting words of encouragement, and the pilot, who was the center of attention, realized that his career might be over. He sank slowly into his seat, silently listening as the situation escalated into a public scandal he could no longer control. Snoop had been quiet the whole time, but as he watched his team and the support of the men, his confidence only grew stronger. He knew this was no longer just a matter of his place in first grade. This was a battle he had to win, for the sake of everyone who faced this every day. The pilot sat in his seat by the cockpit door, his face flaming with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He straightened up, determined that he would not give up his position without a fight. There was something more than stubbornness in his eyes. It was the confidence of a man who was used to thinking he was right by default. "I've said enough," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the noise of the cabin. "I'm doing my job. If anyone doesn't like it, you can go to the airline office after boarding." The passengers aghast when they heard those words. His tone was not only disrespectful, but provoked more indignation. "After landing," shouted a woman in a business suit, sitting close to the scene of the conflict. "You think this is all just going to be forgotten? People are already recording video." A man sitting next to him added, "We see everything. This is not a mistake. You are deliberately trying to demean a person because of their skin color." The pilot looked at the man who spoke as if he wanted to shame him, but instead only made it worse. "No one has the right to accuse me of racism," he said with cold confidence. "I judge passengers by their behavior, not by their appearance." Snoop finally raised his hand, gesturing for silence. His voice was still calm, but his calmness was threatening. "You're talking about behavior," he began. "Then tell me, what was it about my behavior that you didn't like? What was it that made you think I was substandard?" The pilot looked at him and something flashed in his eyes that couldn't be ignored. He knew his words were in the crosshairs, but he stubbornly didn't want to back down. "Let me put it this way. First-class passengers should be able to respect others." Those words hit like a hammer. They didn't just hint, they directly questioned Snoop's moral character without explaining the basis for that opinion. "Respect?" Snoop took a step forward, and his voice grew louder. "Are you saying I don't respect someone? Or is that your way of saying people like me don't deserve to be here?" "I didn't say anything like that," the pilot replied quickly, but his tone gave it away. "You meant it," added one of the passengers. "We can all hear it." Now the conflict was open. Tension was rising like a thunderstorm. People in the cabin began to rise from their seats. Some loudly voiced their support for Snoop. Others shouted phrases like, "Shame," and "Get him off the flight." James, Snoop's manager, leaned toward him and said quietly, "This has to stop. We've already won." But Snoop shook his head. "No," he said firmly, "it's not just about me." He turned to the pilot again. "You were talking about respect. Well, respect has to be earned, and you've lost it." The pilot, as if defending himself, waved his hand. "It's not my problem. If you don't like the way I do my job, you can leave the plane." That moment became a boiling point. One of the female passengers shouted loudly, "It's Snoop Dogg. He deserves a seat in first class more than you deserve your pilot's seat." The words elicited a storm of applause, but the pilot could no longer hear. His face was red, and he had lost his temper. "It's my right to decide who's fit for first class," he shouted, his voice overpowering everything else. That phrase was what was missing. The video recording passengers immediately captured a moment that confirmed the worst suspicions. This was no longer just a matter of convenience. It was a clash of generations, class, and, no doubt, racial prejudice. Snoop looked at the pilot, and his look said more than any words could. It was the look of a man who had endured too long, but was not going to be silent any longer. "You know what's funny?" he finally said. "You think you have power, but you've already lost it." His words were drowned in loud shouts of approval from the passengers, and somewhere in the corner of the cabin there was a whisper, "This flight will go down in history." The situation on board reached a new height of heat. The passengers, who at first had watched the pilot's humiliating behavior in silence, could no longer contain their indignation. The anger that had begun to smolder in their hearts from the pilot's first words now turned into an open flame of solidarity. The first to stand up was an elderly woman in an austere suit. Her hair was in a neat bun, and her voice, despite her age, sounded firm and loud. "I have been flying first class for over 30 years, and I've never seen anyone humiliated like this. This is unacceptable." She turned to Snoop and said, "If you want my seat, Mr. Dogg, I'll give it to you right now." These words caused cheers among the passengers. A few people clapped their hands in support. Her gesture signaled to the others that no one was going to tolerate such behavior. A man in an expensive suit, sitting across the aisle, raised his hand and declared loudly, "If that's what it takes to stop this disgrace, I'm willing to give up my seat too. This man deserves respect." The pilot turned pale when he heard this. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His stance weakened with each passing second as the passengers stood up one by one to show their support for Snoop. "We all know what's going on," added the young guy with the beard shooting the video. "It's not about the rules, it's about the fact that you think he doesn't deserve to be here, and we're not going to stand for it." The passengers began to applaud, but it wasn't just a gesture of support. It was an open challenge to the pilot. Every camera movement, every word became part of a collective protest against an injustice that could no longer be hidden. Amidst the commotion rose the voice of a woman sitting at the end of the parlor. "I don't know who the pilot is, but I do know that he shouldn't be working with people anymore." Many agreed with her, nodding and supporting her words. One of the men even stood up to address the stewardess. "We demand that he be removed from the controls of this flight immediately. We will not be traveling with him." The man's words added fuel to the fire. More and more passengers began to raise their voices, demanding punishment for the pilot. People began to organize spontaneously, discussing among themselves how to get justice. "If the airline doesn't do it," said one of them, "we will all write statements, and I will personally send this video to the media." Meanwhile, the flight attendants, trying to maintain some semblance of control, were walking around the cabin, calming people down. But they also realized that the situation was out of their control. A senior flight attendant, seeing the growing tension, approached the pilot and whispered something in his ear. The pilot's face turned as white as paper. He shook his head as if he could not believe what was happening. Snoop was silent as he watched the scene. He saw people, seemingly complete strangers to each other, come together as one. Their anger was not just for him, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. Then another man stood up, and his words, loud and confident, caught everyone's attention. "You think this is just one case, but it's not. It's a symbol of what we fight against every day. People with power who think they can decide who is worthy and who is not. And today we say, enough is enough." These words elicited loud applause and shouts of approval. It seemed that the whole salon was now on Snoop's side. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment, every word. This was no longer just an incident on board. It was a movement that started with one person, but became a voice for all. The pilot, finally confused, tried to stand up and say something, but was interrupted. "You are no longer in charge," shouted one of the passengers. "We will no longer allow you to humiliate people." At this point, an airline representative appeared on board and was called by ground services. She looked tense, realizing that the situation was out of control. She tried to address the passengers, but her words were drowned out by loud shouts. "Get him off the plane. We're not flying with that man." Snoop, still silent, finally raised his hand, calling for silence. His voice, calm but firm, drew attention again. "I appreciate all your support," he said, turning to the passengers. "But this is no longer about me. It's about all of us. Every time someone decides we're not worthy, they think they can cover it up. Today, they were wrong." Snoop's words sparked a new wave of applause. His support became a symbol of the fight for justice. Even though the conflict was not over yet, everyone realized that the truth would win. While the passengers warmed up the atmosphere with their loud protests and shouts, Snoop's team acted quickly and strategically, like a group of professionals accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. James, Snoop's manager, had already managed to contact the airline's ground support. His voice was sharp and confident, the words sounding as if each one could ruin the career of whoever stood in his way. "I won't tell you twice," James said into the telephone receiver. "You have a public scandal on board right now because of your pilot. He openly discriminated against my client on the basis of his race. Dozens of passengers are already taking video. If you don't want to see this on the front page of the news, you need to step in. Now." The other end of the line was clearly in turmoil. The airline representative to whom the situation had been referred tried to justify herself, but James wasn't listening. He knew that the main thing now was to press on until the management realized that this was a serious matter. "You have exactly 5 minutes to contact your crew and resolve this matter," he added, glancing at Monica, who continued filming everything that was going on around her. "Or we'll take this story to such a level that your company won't recover from this scandal." Meanwhile, Monica had already started uploading some of the videos to social media, tagging them with popular hashtags: "Your racism," "In the skies," "Your Snoop Dogg fight back," "Your equality now." She knew that all it took was one successful post for the situation to go beyond the airplane and become a viral scandal. Her fingers flew across the phone screen as she wrote a post that succinctly stated the point. An airline pilot denied Snoop Dogg the right to fly first class. The reason? Obvious racism. Passengers support Snoop. The airline is silent. Equality for all. On board, meanwhile, the tension continued to rise. The pilot sat in his seat as if glued, his face turned white, and he seemed to realize that his position was becoming untenable. The passengers did not retreat. They shouted throughout the cabin that he should be suspended, demanding justice. Words like racism, discrimination, shame were being shouted louder and louder. Even those who had not initially intervened now joined the protest, realizing that silence in such a situation means complicity. Snoop was still remarkably calm, but his crew was working non-stop. Monica walked over to the senior flight attendant and stood in front of him like a wall. "If you don't want this to be a disaster for your company, you need to contact senior management immediately. We demand immediate intervention." The flight attendant nodded, realizing he couldn't ignore their demands. He retired to the cockpit to contact the dispatchers and company management. Meanwhile, James continued to negotiate with the airline representatives. His tone became increasingly harsh, and every word sounded like an ultimatum. "You're not just dealing with my client. You're dealing with a world celebrity," he said, glaring at the stewardess who stood helplessly by. "And you didn't just insult him. You've humiliated every passenger who now sees a man with a biased attitude abusing his power. If you don't fix the problem, I will personally make sure it costs you more than just your reputation." The senior flight attendant reappeared on board, his face tense. He walked up to Snoop and said quietly, "We've contacted our management. They're looking into the situation." "Studying?" Monica interjected, her voice shaking with anger. "There's no need to study anything here. It's obvious." Meanwhile, passengers started shouting demands. People stood up from their seats, not allowing the flight attendants to calm them down. One of the men loudly stated, "If this pilot doesn't get off the flight, we're all going to refuse to fly." These words caused a new outburst of approval. The passengers supported the idea, and it was obvious that their indignation had reached its limit. There was an energy of collective resistance in the air, and the pilot could feel it. He still sat motionless, but his confidence had evaporated. He realized that he was now outnumbered. Finally, the call from the airline management reached the senior flight attendant. He listened attentively, nodding, and then turned to the pilot. "You are requested to leave the flight," he said firmly. The words came like a thunderclap. The pilot looked up, his face pale, his eyes glittering with anger. "It's my decision," he tried to object. "I was just doing my job." "No," the senior flight attendant interrupted him. "You have exceeded your authority. We can't continue this flight with you." The passengers broke into applause. Someone shouted, "Justice has been done." People got up from their seats to watch the pilot pack up. He rose slowly, as if he hoped it was just a bad dream. But this was a reality he had created himself. Snoop looked at all this without too much emotion. He didn't need revenge. He had already won. The passengers, his crew, and the world that would soon see this footage had sided with justice. When the pilot left the plane, Snoop sat down in his seat in the first class and calmly said, "This is what the truth looks like." As the pilot stepped outside the plane, the silence that had briefly enveloped the cabin immediately exploded with loud applause and shouts of approval. It was the triumph of the moment, a collective victory for the passengers, Snoop and his crew. But the pilot's face, flaming with anger and humiliation, showed that he was not ready to accept his defeat. He turned to the chief flight attendant, hoping to beg for some sympathy. "You don't realize what you're doing," he muttered, his voice shaking. "This is my career, my life." But the chief flight attendant remained adamant. "You overstepped your authority and violated professional standards," he said coldly. "You did it yourself." Those words sounded like a sentence. The pilot looked around once more, his eyes roving over the passengers, hoping to find at least one supporter. But instead, he met only looks of contempt, indignation, and outright triumph. The passengers looked at him the way one looks at a man who has lost not only his job, but also the respect of society. Meanwhile, Monica continued filming. Her camera captured every detail: the pilot's tense face, his awkward movements as he picked up his things, and the moment he disappeared behind the gangway door. She knew that this footage would become the centerpiece of a story that was already starting to go viral on social media. Outside the plane, the pilot was met by airline representatives. They were in strict suits, their faces were serious, but the words they said were loud and clear. "You are suspended from your duties. Please hand over your identification document and your cabin key." This scene unfolded in front of the passengers through the windows of the airplane. Some even filmed the scene with their phones. The pilot, still red with anger, tried to argue. "You can't just do this to me," he screamed. "This is wrong. I was just doing my job." But his words were drowned in the cold responses of the representatives. "Your behavior has become unacceptable. You have violated not only airline policy, but also basic principles of respect for passengers." On board, the tension eased a little. People started discussing what had happened among themselves, sharing their impressions and plans to tell their friends, families, and of course on the internet. But the center of attention remained Snoop, who was sitting in his seat in the first class, quietly looking out the window. James walked over to him, sitting down in the seat next to him. "Everything is under control," he said. "The company has already started to deal with the situation. Monica's video has gone viral. It seems that major accounts have already started reposting it." Snoop nodded, but his face remained focused. He realized that this was more than just an airplane humiliation. It was a case that reflected what he had encountered throughout his life: bias, discrimination, an unwillingness to see beyond the image of a person. The pilot, now ex-pilot, walked through the airport as if in a fog. It was hard for him to realize that his world had collapsed in just a few hours. He was sure he was right, sure he could defend his opinion, but the reality was different. His face was caught on dozens of cameras. His actions became a public shame that would not be forgotten. Emergency meetings began at the airline's office. Managers were reviewing videos, listening to audio recordings of passengers, and were already preparing to issue an official statement. "We have to fire him," said one of the managers, reviewing the details of the incident. "Otherwise, it will be a disaster for our reputation." "Firing him is not enough," another objected. "We need to publicly apologize to Snoop. He's a world-class star, and we just insulted him in front of hundreds of people." While the company was looking for ways out of the crisis, the story was already spreading around the world. Major news portals began to pick up the video, and hashtags became trending. "Pilot discriminates against Snoop Dogg" were the headlines that flashed across phone, computer, and TV screens. At the airport, where the plane soon landed, Snoop walked out with his head held high. His team accompanied him, and the crowd of journalists, already gathered at the exit, rushed to ask questions. "How do you feel after the incident? Do you think the airline should do more?" Snoop stopped for a moment, looked at the cameras, and said, "It's not just about me. It's about the fact that this behavior is unacceptable for anyone. Today, it was me, and tomorrow it could be someone else. I am grateful to everyone who supported me, but we must remember that the fight for justice never ends." These words have spread around the world, becoming a symbol of the fight against prejudice and racism. And the pilot? He became an example that even those who are accustomed to their power are not immune to the consequences if they use it incorrectly. A story that began as a random outbreak of prejudice ended up as a powerful symbol of resistance and justice that spread around the world. The incident aboard the plane uncovered hidden layers of racism that often go unnoticed or ignored. But thanks to the unity of the people who dared to stand up to injustice, the incident has become a lesson that will long be remembered. After landing, the airline immediately released an official statement. It apologized to Snoop and all passengers on the flight. Airline executives said they had launched an internal investigation and emphasized their commitment to equality and respect. But their words sounded too formal, too late. The world had already seen the truth through dozens of passenger videos, and the words spoken by the pilot had already gone viral, becoming an example of how deep-seated prejudices can destroy lives. Snoop Dogg, used to a life in the crosshairs of the cameras, realized that his role didn't end there. He knew that his silence now would send the wrong message to those who were looking at this situation with hope. And so he decided to act. The next day, he gave an interview that was broadcast to millions of people around the world. His voice sounded calm but firm, like the voice of a man who is used to struggle but tired of its permanence. This was not an isolated incident, he said, looking directly into the camera. "It was a manifestation of what people like me face every day. You can be successful, famous, respected, but that doesn't protect you from those who see you only as the color of your skin. This isn't about tickets or airplane seats. It's about a system that teaches some people to think they are better than others." His words provoked a strong reaction. They inspired those who had been silently tolerating injustice, afraid to raise their voices. People began to share their stories, talking about the discrimination they had faced in their lives. Snoop's story became the catalyst for thousands of voices who no longer wanted to be silent. Meanwhile, the pilot who became the centerpiece of the scandal was completely isolated. The airline fired him 2 days after the incident, saying his actions were contrary to company values. But that dismissal didn't solve the problem he epitomized. On social media, his name became a household name. People discussed not only what he had done, but also how many people like him continue to work in systems that seemingly should provide equality and security for all. However, not everyone saw this as a victory story. There were still voices in the comments and discussions who tried to justify the pilot's actions by saying that he was just doing his job, or it was a misunderstanding. These comments only emphasized how deeply rooted racism is in society and how difficult it is to uproot. Snoop understood this. Instead of settling for victory, he announced the creation of a new project aimed at combating racism in air travel and other areas of life. His goal was not only to bring attention to the problem, but also to change the system that allowed such incidents to happen. "I can't change the past," he said in an interview, "but I can use this moment to change the future. It's not just about airplanes. It's about schools, offices, streets. It's about looking at each other and teaching children that all people are equal." His initiative found support around the world. Large corporations began to revise their policies, introducing additional training to combat bias and discrimination. Passengers who witnessed the incident spoke out on various platforms about how their views had changed after what they had witnessed. But the most powerful moment was a letter written by one of the passengers who had never thought about such things before. In his letter, he admitted that he himself had allowed preconceived thoughts in the past, but what he saw that day made him reconsider everything he believed in. "I realized that indifference makes me part of the problem. I won't be silent anymore." The story ended not with the triumph of one person, but with a powerful collective statement. The rights and dignity of everyone is important, regardless of status, color, or background. The case was a reminder that even the smallest acts of discrimination have huge consequences. But it also showed that people united by a common purpose can defeat even the deepest prejudices. Snoop Dogg, sitting in the first-class seat on his next flight, looked out the window and smiled. This wasn't just a victory. It was a step toward something bigger. His seat in first class was a symbol that no one can ever make a person feel unworthy if they know their own worth. And the plane soared into the sky, taking with it a lesson that would leave a mark on generations. Friends, we want to know what you think. What do you think about this story? Have you or your loved ones faced similar cases of racism in your life? Share your stories in the comments. Your opinion is really important for us. We appreciate each of you and thank you for your support. You are part of our community, and it inspires us to continue sharing such important stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like if you like the video. This helps us to develop our project and share more interesting and meaningful stories with you. We wish you a wonderful day and justice in every moment of life.